Say something. One of the things is when I do these lectures, I not only have fun doing them, but there's something that I had once used when I taught. I used to teach at Boston University Metropolitan College in the evening, and a lecture on molasses was integral to the early part of the colonial history of Boston because it was part of the triangle trade between Boston, Africa, the West Indies, and the Caribbean, back to Boston. And as you'll see when we discuss this in the lecture, it was an integral part of their world trade economy. But during the period of the 18th century, with slavery, we'll see this lecture itself evolve. So it's in three parts. The first part is basically slavery from the western coast of Africa, abolitionism in Boston in the 19th century, and then one of Boston's many firsts, the first molasses flood in the world. Now, surprisingly, today is January 15th, and the molasses flood happened today on January 15th, 1919. So I hope when you go home, you at least have some sort of a molasses treat, whether it's baked beans, a molasses cookie, or gingerbread. I'm making gingerbread for supper's dessert tonight. It does, actually. Well, the whole idea is when I do a lecture in some ways, I try to make it something that involves all of us. So in that instance, molasses is something that isn't just a sweetener. It's also something that is part of our lives. And I bet at one time or another, each one of us had some sort of a bottle of molasses, and this is grandma's molasses, on the kitchen shelf. Well, molasses is a thick syrup produced during the refining of sugar or from sorghum, varying from light to dark brown in color. Molasses is created from the refining of sugarcane or sugar beet juice into sugar. Molasses varies in the amount of sugar, the methods of extraction, and the age of the plant. And sugarcane molasses is usually used to sweeten and flavor foods. Molasses is a major constituent in the fine commercial brown sugar. Well, the whole idea is, in some ways, molasses might be a sweetener, but it was also something that actually fueled the economy. Now, seen here in a map, and this is something that would actually deal with latter part of the 17th century and the 18th century, it was part of the triangular trade. And as you can see on the upper left-hand side, we have North America, and down below, the West Indies and the Caribbean. And on the right, we have Britain and West Africa. And if you kind of look at that, it looks like a triangle. And that ship is bringing rum and sugar not only to North America, but also to Britain. They're going to Africa to procure slaves, and then to come back on the middle passage to the West Indies and the Caribbean, where many of these people were enslaved, and then used on plantations to cultivate, grow, and produce molasses. Well, in that instance, we realized as early as the part of the 16th century, slavery had become something that was a great boon to the economy of Africa. Seen here in a print of a map of basically 1775, we look at the area called the West Coast or the Guinea Coast. That actually includes the Grain Coast, Gold Coast, Slave Coast, and Benin. Now, during that period, not only were the Dutch, but the Portuguese were trading in slavery. But it wasn't necessarily the Western Europeans that were procuring the slaves. During this period of time, there were many tribal wars. And this print, which dated to the latter part of the 18th century, showed a typical African village. These were mud huts with a thatched roof, and in the foreground you began to see some sort of a ritual, but it included people that were seniors, adults, young adults, teenagers, and children. It was truly a community of anywhere from 300 to 500 people. But because of these tribal wars, even though everyone was African, we would see many people enslaving their fellow African. And in that way, upon the descent at night, with bows and arrows, later by rifles, by the 17th century, in order to satisfy European demand, African slave raiders needed more captives to sell as slaves to the Europeans. And that necessitated starting and expanding more raids and subsequently more wars to obtain them. Well, in this instance, at least 10% of the population would be decimated simply by the descent with arrows and later guns. In 1518, the King of Spain, King Charles I, issued a charter authorizing the transportation of slaves direct from Africa to the Americas. Up until that point, since at least 1510, African slaves had usually been transported to Spain or Portugal and had then been transshipped to the Caribbean. This shows people being walked to the coast, where, of course, there would be fortresses. It was primarily the Gold Coast or the Slave Coast. And in that way, it was only at that point they would actually meet Western Europeans. These prints, which dated to the early 19th century, show again the aspect of an entire community being enslaved. Men, women, children of all ages. But the whole concept was the transatlantic slave trade involved the purchase by Europeans of enslaved men, women, and children from Africa and their transportation to the Americas where they were sold for profit. And between 1517 and 1867, about 12.5 million Africans began the Middle Passage across the Atlantic, enduring cruel treatment, disease, and paralyzing fear aboard slave ships. This print, that dated to about 1815, showed the first encounter with Western Europeans. And again, we see two men in the foreground subjugating an African man to be placed into a rowboat who would then be taken to the slave ships in the harbor. Well, these slave ships, which had begun in the 16th and early 17th century, primarily the Dutch and the Portuguese, were quite small. They were cargo ships, and they could actually hold anywhere from 250 to 300 enslaved Africans. But they also held cargo. Now, when we think of cargo, we think of wooden barrels filled with flour or sugar or molasses, but this was human cargo, and it was something that would take anywhere from 12 to 15 weeks to cross the Atlantic to come to the New World. It didn't differ from one ship to the other, and by the 18th century, it was not only England, but even the United States that was involved in the slave trade. But the people would be brought from those small rowboats, ascend a ladder, usually with their hands actually tied behind their backs, as we would probably do, trying to escape, and be placed into a cargo hold. Remember, they're not a barrel of whiskey, they're a person, but they're cargo. And in that way, we began to realize that even the French began to show this deck-by-deck plan of a slave ship. Now, on the left-hand side would be the most bottom of the decks, and it's actually filled with barrels, cheek by jowl. The second deck was again filled with barrels, cheek by jowl. But the third deck showed where human cargo was actually located. And in this instance, with between 250 and 300 people, it was really quite cramped. These ships, in that instance, would actually make a profit if they could actually bring them and sell them. So the more people, the bigger the profit. And in that instance, seen here in a cross-section of one of these slave ships, we see manacles as well as locks on the upper left-hand side that would not only be used to cuff hands but feet. And we see in the very center what would actually be people on the edges of the deck, but the interior of the deck would be filled with cargo that would also be sold. So it's something you realize in some instances. They weren't perceived as human beings. They were slaves, but they were also cargo. And in that way, it was something that was even to be regulated in some ways. So that the condition of the slaves on leaving a ship called the Echo was painful and disgusting in the extreme. They had been huddled together closer than cattle and slept at night in as close contact as spoons when packed together. Privation of every kind, coupled with disease, had reduced all of them to the merest skeletons and to such a state of destitute and debility that on entering the fort, which means where they would actually be sold at auction, they could not so much as step over a small beam 1 foot high in the doorway, but were compelled to sit on it and balance themselves over. It is impossible for you to imagine their sad and distressed condition. And looking at the right, on the upper portion, you can see people on the deck manacled to the wooden deck, hands and feet, and lower portion shows the cargo hold down below and the human cargo above. Well, by the period of the 19th century, this is actually the British government actually regulating the slave trade. This is a broadside that actually showed that you couldn't hold more than 500 human beings within these ships. That's the most comfortable travel I've ever had. But in that way, we began to realize it was also something you had to realize. If you didn't feed your cargo, you didn't water your cargo, and you didn't exercise your cargo, you reduced the profit that you would get at the slave auction. So in this instance, you see people, again, cheek by jowl on each individual deck. And by the period of 1810, these ships were no longer really carrying cargo except for food, and it was all slaves. In that instance, this is a watercolor painting of about 1835. It shows, again, humanity. Men, women, children, some sleeping on wooden pallets that actually are 2 stories in height, and in the very center, a man reaching up for a bowl of water. In that way, these people themselves were an important commodity because they were part of the triangle trade. And the aspect was that as soon as they saw land, all of these people would be brought up onto deck. They'd be washed down with seawater, given a little bit of a filling meal, and oiled. The better they looked, the better they acted, the higher the price they would bring. And in that way, arriving at the West Indies and in the Caribbean, we would see upwards, over a period of less than 250 years, over 12 million Africans brought to the New World. Well, this map is basically the Grand Theater of Amerique. This is a French map. And we see not only Cuba and Puerto Rico, Santo Domingo, but all of the individual islands as well as the northern tip of South America. All of these islands were in an aspect of different countries. I mean, the Netherlands, France, England, not only the United States, but the whole aspect was there were plantations on these islands. And these plantations were usually very self-sufficient. Not only was there, as you see here in this watercolor from 1815, a master's house and, of course, slave quarters, but the extents of the property. Extensive lands that would actually incorporate not just sugarcane, but everything needed to operate a plantation. Fruit orchards, vegetable gardens, as well as, of course, palm trees, which provided palm oil. But once sugar and other export crops began to be cultivated in the Americas, nearly every Western European country participated in the transatlantic slave trade. To secure full cargoes, European traders built castles or factories at ports on the coast where they could collect people and goods for sale. And the sites, places like Gorée, Cape Coast Castle, and Ouida, became launching points for European colonization. When they came, they would be acclimated to generations of slaves that had been brought since the period of the 17th century. This is a print that dates to about 1820. It not only shows people in the foreground, men and women, but they've actually laid out property to be planted with sugar cane. These were 3 by 3 foot squares of soil, and of course sugar cane, which simply can be placed into the ground, watered, cultivated, will grow eventually twice annually. This was an important feature because of the intensity of the heat, the intensity of the sun, and constant cultivation. And seen here again in another print of the same period, we see people, men, women, and children, cultivating these individual sugarcane lots. The sugarcane itself, and if you've seen it in tropical markets, is usually cut into 2 to 3 foot lengths, but these will grow 6 to 8 feet in height. And of course, it's something that in a lot of ways, having 2 ripenings annually is a cash crop, so to speak. Well, over the 5 to 6 months that it would grow, constant watering would eventually make it into something that would have to be cultivated. Not just cultivated, but eventually cut. And when the cutting season came, you'd see everyone, including the family from the plantation, coming out to use scythes to cut down the sugarcane. Now, it looks like bamboo, and I love bamboo. I have it in my garden. But the whole concept is it can get to be a very thick, hard substance that has to be used with great skill. In this way, we see on the right-hand side a donkey cart where actually 3-foot pieces of sugarcane have now been placed. They'd be brought to the sugar house. And in that instance, this was something that happened twice annually for centuries. And during that period, people would actually realize in some ways that their white sugar, brown sugar, not only molasses, but sorghum molasses, which is the least refined, would be something that came from this. On the left-hand side, they would have these things, and this is something from a children's reader, and it says the progress of sugar. And we see a slave cutting the sugarcane plant in such a way with this sword, but it would be a scythe, and it says cutting down. Well, they romanticize it. It says, now comes merry time, Negroes all alive. Down we cut the cane, suck the juice and thrive. Mule grow fat as hog, though much work be bare. Horse and cow grow fat, starving is no there. Well, it was harvest time, and not only did the slaves eat well, but also the animals. And on the right-hand side, you can see in some instances with the height of the slaves that the height of the sugarcane was, as I mentioned, sometimes 8 feet high. Well, in that way, in the mid-17th century, British-owned Barbados rapidly developed into a slave society growing sugarcane. I only use that as an example. It was all of the islands. The capital and technology supplied by the Dutch were instrumental in bringing this about, unleashing a revolution in the production of sugarcane, and with the essential ingredients being the Dutch supply of African slaves. Well, on the right, we see a slave, again with the sugarcane itself, but on the left-hand side, you can see the original piece from the last crop on the left-hand side, a thick piece of sugarcane that has been placed into the soil, watered, cultivated, and of course allowed to grow. And from that piece comes the new crop. But every bit of it had to be brought to a sugar house. And in my readings, one of the surprising things is that the sugar houses were always run by an elderly slave woman. In this instance, this was the Dutch influence. We see a windmill. Now, a windmill is synonymous with the Dutch culture, but the windmill was important because it turned grist mills that would actually grind the sugar cane. Now, it was great if it was a windy day because it could be done without manpower. But once the sugarcane pieces were brought, they were brought into the sugarcane house, and of course, they'd be ground, as we hope, by the wind turning the turbine that would actually grind by the granite grist mill. Unfortunately, this print, which dates to the 18th century, on the upper left-hand side, tells us that it's not a windy day, and that the slaves are pushing that grist mill to grind the sugarcane into a pulp. Once it's ground into a pulp, it's placed into the cauldron on the left-hand side, filled with water, but with the ground pulp, it's boiled to the point that the sugar or the sweetness of the sugarcane is extracted, skimmed off, placed into the terracotta urns in the very center, and then taken out to be cooled for the first process of making molasses and eventually refining it even further to make brown sugar or white sugar. This didn't differ from one day to the next, and it's still done in many instances throughout the islands, but it was something you began to realize that now became a cash crop. Not only did you have a plantation where many people were not only working as slaves, but you also had to feed everyone, whether you were the master or the slave. And in this way, you realized that it had a grouping of people that didn't just cultivate sugarcane. They had coopers who built the barrels. They had strap makers who would forge the metal straps. They had gardeners that would do the fruit orchards, the vegetable gardens, build the houses, maintain the property. But here, after the sugarcane itself had been made into molasses, they were placed into wooden barrels. Now, each of these barrels would hold 40 gallons of molasses, and they were called hogsheads of molasses. And in that way, you can imagine the density. They were extremely heavy. They had to be pushed by two men, and as you see here, they're pushing them towards the ocean, where they would be placed with the aid of two boards onto a small rowboat to be rowed out to a ship in the harbor. Now, this could be any island, Antigua, Barbados, but the whole idea was that slaves arduously loaded hogsheads or barrels filled with molasses onto a small boat called a droger to be transported to the largest ship sitting in the harbor of St. John's in Antigua. In that instance, this was the first step to come to New England. And the idea was that molasses was something that was used in the distillation of rum. Well, I haven't had a glass of rum since my college days, and there's a reason for that. I'm still looking for my car. But in this instance, we see a print of a young man of the Revolution. He's actually standing there in period dress with a small glass pouring from a stoneware jug rum, and it's called a dram. Make mine a dram of rum. Well, during the colonial era, rum was by far the drink of choice in Boston due to easy access and an affordable price. Rum, along with punch, were a staple on menus in taverns throughout the colonies. And by one estimate, colonists consumed 3.7 gallons annually per head, including children, by the time of the American Revolution. Our ancestors didn't trust water, so whether it was hard cider or rum, choose your own imbibement. But due to several factors, including the increased enforcement of a tax on molasses, which increased the price, along with the westward expansion, it was much easier to grow corn for whiskey than ship molasses barrels on wagons. Rum's popularity eventually began to decrease. And at the time of the Revolution, there were 31 rum distilleries in and around Boston. Rum was by far the drink of choice. And in that instance, it was something that not only packed a punch, but it was something in some ways that was very inexpensive. The one that I deal with here is the Lawrence Rum Distillery that was in Medford, Massachusetts. Medford was settled in 1630. It's on the Mystic River just north of Boston. And seen here was the Lawrence House on the right and the Lawrence Distillery on the left. This was on Ship Street that ran parallel to the Mystic River where shipbuilding took place, but it today is known as Riverside Avenue, and this is Medford Square. Well, the Lawrences in the 18th century began to make rum, and the rum was made from the molasses that was shipped to New England. And seen here, Daniel Lawrence and Sons would actually make what they called Medford Old Rum. Now this says extra 1870. I never knew that rum came in vintages, but this was sold by S.S. Pierce and Company well into the period of Prohibition. So we knew that rum could either be a very smooth drink or something that was really quite harsh. But it was said to be the best rum in the United States, and of course, Daniel Lawrence and Sons would do this for 4 generations. The Lawrence family would actually see this continue right through to the time of the Civil War. But it was at the point when the 4th generation, which was Samuel Crocker Lawrence, wanted to run for the first mayoral position after Medford had embraced a city government, that he would actually realize that this was somewhat of a contentious issue. He had served as colonel of the Lawrence Light Guard in the Civil War and was the founder of the hospital in Medford that bears his name, the Lawrence Memorial Hospital. Well, my mother always said it's liquor money, but of course it was good money. And in that instance, many people said that he had to disassociate himself from his 4th generation business if he wanted to be the first mayor of Medford. Well, he sold the rum distillery and he invested it in land. And he owned over 1,100 acres, which was then called the Lawrence Estates, which is a very upscale neighborhood community in Medford on the edge of Winchester. But Medford Old Rum, which has recently begun to be distilled again, was something in some ways that had made this family's fortune. But realize that fortune could only be raised and made through the aspect of slavery. Well, slavery was known in Massachusetts as early as 1637 in Boston when African slaves were brought here. Many people who actually utilized Boston would realize that the Faneuil Hall, we call it the Cradle of Liberty, was something that was given to the town of Boston by Peter Faneuil. Now, Peter Faneuil's name is probably very familiar. He was a French Huguenot, and his family were Protestants living in France. Now, during the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, Louis XIV, King of France, decided that if you were living in France, you had to be Roman Catholic. And if you did not embrace Roman Catholicism, you had to leave France. Well, many of the French Protestants did leave, and they became known as Huguenots. They went not only to the Amsterdam, to London, but they came to the New World. And Peter Faneuil's family were French traders. Even though they weren't Roman Catholic, they still could trade with France. So we would realize in some instances they were bringing fine wines, linens, laces, and all sorts of things from Paris. But many people don't realize that the Faneuils were also making at least 50% of their wealth through slavery. Directly behind Faneuil Hall was a place that we call Dock Square today. Doesn't exist because it was infilled for Quincy Market. But in the 18th century, Dock Square was where the ships docked in Boston and where the slave auction took place. Seen here in an advertisement from the Boston newspaper, it says Charlestown, July 24th, 1769. This appeared on the Thursday, the 3rd day of August, a cargo of 94 prime healthy Negroes consisting of 39 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls just arrived in the brig Dembia from Sierra Leone. This would happen throughout the colonies, not just Boston. But in this instance, many of us realize that Boston had slavery as late as 1781. And in this way, Peter Faneuil was really no different than any other wealthy merchant in Boston. Granted, Peter Faneuil had slaves in his house on Beacon Hill, but he made 50% of his wealth through the slave auction. And in that way, many people are perceived in the 18th century as being immoral. These are human beings. But it was also totally legal. And it was also something that every minister in every village would have at least 1 or 2 slaves. Well, Peter Faneuil was somebody in some ways that realized that this was a great profit. Far more money was brought in than French wine. And it said here in another newspaper advertisement to be sold on board the ship Bank Island on Tuesday, the 6th of May, 1760, a choice cargo of about 250 fine, healthy Negroes just arrived from the Windward and Rice coast. It says that the utmost care has already been taken and shall be continued to keep them free from the least danger of being infected with the smallpox, no boat having been on board, and all other communication with people from Charlestown prevented. Well, the whole idea was smallpox didn't care if you were white or black or free or enslaved. Smallpox was something that was a horrible thing to contract, but it was even worse if it happened to a slave because it actually cut their value by almost 2/3. Well, in that instance, one family that I bring into this lecture is the Royall family. They themselves had started in Dorchester, Massachusetts, when Isaac Royall Sr. was born in 1694. He went to the island of Antigua, and there he purchased a small sugarcane plantation. And with an advantageous marriage, his plantation was over 1,500 acres by the 1720s. His family eventually decided to come back to New England in 1737. And not only did the family come, but they brought 40 slaves with them. This is a portrait by Robert Feek of Isaac Royall Jr. on the right-hand side and his sister Penelope Royall Vassall on the left-hand side. Her house still stands in Cambridge on Brattle Street. It's now the Longfellow House. But we see this as a wealthy family of the colonial era. But their wealth derives from the slave trade and the sugarcane plantation they had in Antigua. When they came back to New England, they built a magnificent mansion on the left-hand side, 12 rooms. Not only did it have slaves that were actually employed in the house, but they also built the slave quarters on the right-hand side. These date to 1737, and they're the only known slave quarters north of the Mason-Dixon line that actually date from this period. During this period, the family had bought 1,100 acres, and they called their estate 10 Hills Farm. It still exists. It's in Medford, Massachusetts, but at that time it was part of Charlestown. And if you can imagine 1,100 acres, it included much of Medford, Charlestown, and Somerville. Well, there's less than an acre of land left, but it's a great example in this instance of slavery, because it existed by the cultivation of not just the grounds, but the maintenance of this grand mansion, which was said to be among the finest in all of New England. Well, the son, Isaac Royall Jr., seen here, was the largest slaveholder in 18th century Massachusetts. His wealth, primarily accrued through enslaved labor in Antigua, made possible the creation of Harvard Law School. Royall and his father owned 64 slaves on the family's estate in today's Medford, Massachusetts, and that's by the time of the Revolution. He endowed the Royall Professorship of Law at Harvard College. And in his portrait by John Singleton Copley, he was said to have been one of the 5 wealthiest men in all of the colonies in North America. His wife was equally sumptuous in a portrait by John Singleton Copley, and seen here, she was 19 when he married Elizabeth McIntosh, the daughter of a friend of Royall's father. The marriage was advantageous and confirmed Royall's place in the colonial elite. His father owned tremendous land in Antigua, and her marriage provided further land. So when they came back to New England, they were among the wealthiest of the slave traders living in the Boston area. And a great example is their daughters of what wealth could actually make. This portrait, which is in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston, again by John Singleton Copley, shows 2 sisters, the daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Royall, not only sumptuously dressed, but Mary holding a bird on her finger and Elizabeth holding a King Charles Spaniel lapdog. Their gowns are incredible. They're well-bred. They're cultivated. And in that instance, this was what slave money could do. Mary would eventually marry the Honorable John Irvin. She did leave Boston during the Revolution and lived in London, where her son became Lord Lyndhurst, who was not only the keeper of the privy purse, but was ennobled. And Elizabeth, who died during the Revolution, had married Lord Sparhawk, and she herself, in some instances, would see no further descendants. But as you can see, molasses was something that could make a lot of wealth. And in this instance, the Royals were a perfect example of what the colonial elite could make. The second part of this lecture is on abolitionism. And seen here in a print of the Massachusetts State House and the Boston Common in the foreground, after the Revolution, we would see that Massachusetts would become the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Previous, it had been Massachusetts Bay Colony. In that way, not only did John Hancock become the first governor of the Commonwealth, but in 1781, the House and the Senate would actually pass a bill that any person held in bondage, whether it was a slave or somebody basically as an apprentice, was to be free forevermore. And in that instance, we would see upwards of 1,000 enslaved Africans living in Boston becoming free citizens. Now, Massachusetts during this period of time was experiencing tremendous growth. It had been a mercantile economy in the 18th century, but by this point it was becoming a manufacturing economy, and many people were involved in it. But after their freeing in 1781, many Africans would move from what was known as Guinea Hill in the North End. Today we call it Copp's Hill, but it was Guinea Hill because of Guinea, the western coast of Africa, and they began to move to the north slope of Beacon Hill. Well, there, a community arose with hundreds of freed African Americans by this point, and that the first black church in Boston was formed there in 1805. It was founded under the leadership of the Reverend Thomas Paul. The first African Baptist church built its meeting house on Smith Court and met there from 1806 to 1898, when it became a Jewish synagogue. But this was something that was designed by Asher Benjamin, one of the foremost architects, not just in Boston, but in New England. The church became a major center of black life and culture in the 1800s Boston, housing a schoolhouse. Boston had segregated schools at that time, and serving as a gathering place for numerous community and abolitionist meetings. So in this instance, the meeting house was an important part of the community, and people would live there. We would actually see wealthy, free blacks, middle class, and even working class. But one man who actually took this into a new step in abolitionism was William Lloyd Garrison. He had been born in Newburyport, but was orphaned young. He became an apprentice at a printer's shop and eventually had his own printing shop in Boston. And his newspaper, which became the voice of the abolitionist community, was an important feature. He said, "I will be harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. No, no. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest, I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, and I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." Well, William Lloyd Garrison was somebody, not only as a second-generation Bostonian, who actually descended from people who had freed anyone of slavery in 1781, said that the South should follow suit. And his newspaper would actually talk about these slave auctions. And though this dates to the 1850s, it shows a man, a woman, and a child, I assume a family, on the slave auction. And that didn't mean that they would actually be sold as a unit. The wife could be sold separately from her child and her husband. And the whole aspect was, by this period, it was thought to be unjust, immoral, that these were human beings. In that instance, he started in some ways to ask people to donate money, to use the purchase of young children to be brought north to be raised in free society. Well, this little wooden box, which he actually printed this and made them into small boxes, said, "Remember your weekly pledge." A weekly collection box for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, contributing according to their ability 1, 2, or 6 cents a week in the little box. The grassroots members of the movement could raise vast amounts of money with little seeming labor or sacrifice. Well, initially in the 1830s, it was primarily the young unmarried daughters of the wealthy who contributed the money. But by the 1830s and 1840s, it began to embrace most people in the Boston area. Many people began to read The Liberator, which was William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper. It was first published on January 1st of 1831, and The Liberator quickly became the preeminent abolitionist newspaper in the United States. Edited by the fiery activist William Lloyd Garrison, this weekly Boston-based periodical served as a major platform to attack slavery and its supporters inspire action and promote equal rights for all. Well, initially it was read in Boston and then further afield, but it was even being read in the American South. Now, the masthead, as you can see here, has, of all people, Jesus Christ in the very center. On the left-hand side is a slave praying to him, obviously for freedom, and on the right-hand side, a slavery advocate holding his arm up. Well, this was something many people realized was creating comment. It was also something because we had now the Underground Railroad that would bring enslaved people from the South to safe houses throughout the North and eventually to freedom in Canada. These broadsides would be placed, and this one appeared in 1851 in Boston. It said, "Caution, colored people of Boston, one and all. You are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with the watchmen and police officers of Boston. For since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers." Now, the whole concept was Boston had eradicated slavery in 1781. But the problem was whether you were free or an escaped slave was a moot point because everyone had the same color skin. So one didn't know. And it says, keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have top eye open. Well, unless you carried your papers with you whenever you left your house, you could be taken off the street and sold into slavery. And during that period, many people would rail at this unfortunate and illegal act. These were free citizens. And seen here, standing on the steps of the Boston Common, is Wendell Phillips. His photograph is on the lower right. Phillips was the son of John Phillips, the first mayor of the city of Boston. He was the 7th generation Phillips to attend Harvard. He was well-spoken. He had attended not only Harvard as a college, but he attended Harvard Law School. Though he never practiced, he was a well-respected man. This is a print from the 1850s from Gleason's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion, an illustrated Boston newspaper. And if you look closely, it says Cradle of Liberty. Of course, Boston has always been perceived. But look at the people, men and women, black and white. It was unusual in the 1850s for men and women to actually be together when any public conversations took place. But to see both Caucasians and Africans, it was even worse. And during that period, Mark Phillips's son became so well known that he was in junction with, of course, Lucy Stone. Now, Lucy Stone is maybe a name you've never heard, but she's incredibly important in the anti-slavery movement. She was the first woman in Massachusetts to be graduated from college. That was Oberlin in 1837. First woman in American history to maintain her maiden name after her marriage. The first female editor of a newspaper, being the Women's Journal, a suffragette newspaper. But she was somebody who not only was to speak on women's rights, but also the anti-slavery movement. So between Phillips and Stone, her husband was John Blackwell, she would actually in some ways go out and speak to polite groups of people. And people began to realize that the Liberator was an important newspaper because it did show a difference of opinion. Now, as I mentioned, Massachusetts went from a mercantile economy of building ships, weaving canvas sails and rope works to actually trade. But by the 1812 period, with the War of 1812, we had to find our own way to manufacture things such as cotton. We had a barricade. The port of Boston was actually blockaded. And the concept here was we could no longer import cotton from France or England. Well, during the 1820s, a man by the name of Abbott Lawrence, a prominent Bostonian, he was a businessman, politician, and philanthropist. And he was among a group of industrialists that founded a settlement on the Merrimack River that would later be named for him, Lawrence, Massachusetts. The company was known as A&A Lawrence and Company and continued until Amos's death in 1855 and became the greatest wholesale mercantile house in the United States. It was successful even in the hard times of the War of 1812. Well, Mr. Lawrence is sitting in his dressing gown and a mameluke. This was the height of fashion in the 1840s. But he was somebody in some ways that had made a fortune, and he wove cotton. And I bet every one of us has something that's made of cotton on today. Well, cotton during that period could be made not just for dresses and shirts and nightshirts, and of course linens for the table, but it was being done in Lowell and Lawrence, Massachusetts, by women that were coming from throughout New England. This Merrimack Manufacturing Company showed that cloth made and printed by them, and they were incorporated in 1822, could now supersede imports of cotton materials. Now, cotton was something that was being used throughout New England, even in the 17th and 18th century. But in this instance, Lawrence was making a fortune. But if you have a cotton manufacturer in Lowell, where is the cotton coming from? Very good. And who's picking the cotton? But we've actually freed the slaves in 1781. How can we possibly bring slave-picked cotton to Boston? So there was a dichotomy in the city, and people were realizing they were really caught between a rock and a hard place. And during that period, many of the young women who would later be supplanted by immigrants from the period of the 1820s to the 1860s would come from the New England countryside. And these shows the cotton mills in both Lowell and Chicopee, Massachusetts, were seeking young women. On the right-hand side, they're wearing dresses made from the cotton that they've actually woven. But these young women would work anywhere from 5 to 10 years, making enough money to return home to marry. But in this instance, the idea of a manufacturer importing cotton to Boston that had been picked by slaves and, of course, sold by slave owners was something that was aghast. Many people began to realize in some ways it wasn't just the newspaper that would actually talk about the evils of slavery, but there was also a book to be published called Uncle Tom's Cabin, Life Among the Lowly. Well, it was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I'm sure you've all heard of her. But did you know that not only her husband was a Unitarian minister, her father was a Unitarian minister, and her two brothers were Unitarian ministers. So I'm sure it must have been a very edifying Thanksgiving dinner. But Uncle Tom's Cabin tells the story of Tom, an honorable, unselfish slave who's taken from his wife and children to be sold at auction. On a transport ship, he saves the life of Eva, a white girl from a wealthy family. And Eva's father purchases Tom, and Tom and Eva become good friends. Well, this was a book in some ways that not only became a bestseller when it was first published in 1852, but it put a face on slavery. Uncle Tom was now a benevolent slave who had risked his life to save the child of the plantation. And in that way, Harriet Beecher Stowe was vilified on one hand and praised on the other. She even met Abraham Lincoln. And in regard to the book, Southerners stubbornly held tight to their belief that slavery was an economic necessity, and enslaved people were inferior people, incapable of taking care of themselves. Well, Abraham Lincoln said upon meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe at the White House in 1862, he said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Well, that war wasn't fought because of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it wasn't fought to actually free the slaves. The Civil War was fought to preserve the Union, because in that period, the South would secede. After the South seceded, we had the Union and the Confederacy. During that period of time in Boston, many young men, and this is Robert Gould Shaw, just graduated from Harvard, would actually be induced by Governor John Albion Andrew, to become the colonel of Company 55. Maybe a few years back you saw the movie Glory. Glory was a very good rendition of a group of men who happened to be black, who lived in Boston that would join Company 55, which was the first African-American regiment to be raised to serve in the Union Army during the Civil War. Well, the whole aspect was many of these men were accountants, lawyers. Someone would actually have been the doorman at the State House, which was a great position. But there was middle class and there were poor. But Robert Gould Shaw was a scion of one of Boston's Brahmin families. And of course, he did much, not only to solicit men to join, but he would join them in being trained at Camp Meigs. Now, Camp Meigs is today in an area that's called Reedville, which is a part of Hyde Park. But before 1868, when Hyde Park was made into an independent town, it was part of Dedham, Massachusetts. On the left, it was named for Montgomery Meigs, who was a very well-known brigadier general. Here, it didn't matter who you were. If you were in the Union Army in Boston, you would be trained here for 8 weeks. You'd live in canvas tents, and you'd learn basically everything you would know, not only to defend yourself, but to hopefully serve the Union. After 8 weeks, you'd be brought by train, and of course, many of these young men were actually encouraged. And it says here on a broadside, to colored men, 54th Regiment, Massachusetts Volunteer, African descent, they offered a $100 bounty at the expiration of the term of service. It doesn't sound like a lot of money, but a very wealthy family could live on $2,000 a year at this time. It offered pay of $13 a month and state aid to families. So many people would join because their families would at least be protected, and they could then serve as a member of the Union Army, not as black members, but as a true member. And on the right-hand side is William Carney, who joined the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry in 1863 and was promoted to sergeant due to his heroism and actions during the Battle of Fort Wagner. He took part in the July 18, 1863 assault on Fort Wagner in Charleston, South Carolina, where half the 54th was decimated, and his actions there ultimately earned him the Medal of Honor, the first man of African descent to win that Medal of Honor. And in that way, many people realized what a horror it was. Well, at the height of the war, Abraham Lincoln would sign the Emancipation Proclamation. And the concept was, like they had done in 1781 in Massachusetts, it freed anybody that was held in bondage in the United States, whether it was the Union or the Confederacy. And the Emancipation Proclamation effectively destroyed the economy of the Southern Confederate States. Slaves were a necessity, whether they were used in the field to pick cotton or tobacco or in factories. And in that instance, we realized that by, of course, the period of 1867, a few years after the Civil War, Lucy Stone, seen in the back row with a lace veil and fichu at her neck, would actually entertain the abolitionists at her home on Pope's Hill in Dorchester. On the far right-hand side, standing with a white hair and beard, I shouldn't say white hair and beard, everyone has white hair and a beard, even the women. But the idea was that the two of them not only were an important part of it, but they would live on until the 1890s and realize that their hard work, like William Lloyd Garrison, had actually proved a wonderful boon. Well, the third part of this lecture is on the North End and the Molasses Flood. And seen here in a map that was done by Albert Mitchell, my great-grandfather, it shows Boston with not only the adjacent cities and towns. Now, Boston is in the very center, originally an 800-acre peninsula connected to the mainland by what was called the Neck, that connected Roxbury and Boston itself. By the period of the 19th century, Boston's population in Boston had averaged around 20,000 people. But beginning in the 1840s, with immigration from Ireland, we began to see the population increasing. initially by matriculation and now by immigration. Boston was bursting at the seams. In 1804, they annexed a portion of Dorchester that they called South Boston. In 1868, they annexed the city of Roxbury. In 1870, they annexed the town of Dorchester. And in 1874, they annexed the city of Charlestown, the town of West Roxbury that included Jamaica Plain and, of course, Roslindale. And we realized in this instance that it wouldn't be until 1912 when they annexed Hyde Park. Boston, by the period of 1870, had a population of 250,000 people, of which one half were either immigrants or the children of immigrants. And most people living in Boston started their lives in the North End. Does anybody recognize this man? This is Paul Revere. Can you imagine? He has white hair like I do. Well, I wish I was as wealthy as he was. But Paul Revere was somebody who was born in Boston's North End, but he's the perfect example of an immigrant. His name isn't Paul Revere. He was baptized Apollos Rivoire, and his father was a French Huguenot, just like the very wealthy Faneuil family. Of course, both of them married English women, and their children would be half French and half English. But the concept was this was a man who was an artisan. And of course, most people think of him as a silversmith. Now, if you're thinking of a Valentine's Day present, forget the candy. I'll take anything in this little picture of Paul Revere silver. But the idea was he was a silversmith, his father as well. But he was also a copperplate engraver, a goldsmith. He made dentures. And of course, during the period of the 19th century, he made bells. But in this instance, Paul Revere became a son of liberty. And it was he who would eventually ride, not only throughout New England as a courier, but he was somebody in some ways that would sound the alarm during the Revolution. Seen here in a statue by Cyrus Dallin, which was placed on the Prado, an area that was created during the WPA in the 1930s in the North End, we see the spire of the Old North Church in the distance. You might remember, one if by land, two if by sea. And of course, Paul Revere took off, supposedly to go to Concord, but he was stopped in Lexington. His partner, William Dawes, took the long way around and took the neck through Roxbury and Brookline and eventually did get to Concord, but he got nothing of credit. Paul Revere eventually saw Henry Wadsworth Longfellow creating a poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. And if you were like me, at Roxbury Latin School, we memorized it. And the idea here was it was an important part. He was an immigrant. And of course, his children would live in the North End. But by the 1840s, immigration from Western Europe was actually becoming prevalent. Initially, it was the French during the Revolution. But by 1840, we would see the Irish coming to the New World because of famine. The potato crop had failed successively for 3 years, and they came by clipper ship. So these clipper ships, initially built for trade, would now become something that brought steerage passengers to the New World. Now remember, in the 18th century, African slaves were brought to the New World as cargo. During this period, we had people traveling steerage, and it was no better than slaves coming to the New World. They were called coffin ships. They were filled cheek by jowl, and the people had to bring their own food and water. Otherwise, they starved and died and were thrown overboard. During this period, most of the people coming, initially from Ireland, later from Germany in the 1850s after a social revolution, Russian Jews escaping pogroms, and eventually even Italians escaping penury. During that period, Boston Harbor was said at the time of the Civil War to see an average of 1,100 people coming to the New World every single week. We're talking upwards of 50,000 people. Seen here in a painting by Robert Salmon, these clipper ships, initially built by Donald Mackay and his shipyards on Border Street in East Boston, were an important part, not just of that transatlantic trade, but also, as we would see, of bringing many of our ancestors to the New World. Well, in some ways, by the 1890s, Paul Revere was a part of the North End, but the area was now being called Little Italy. This is a postcard from 1905, and it shows men standing in North Square. Just to the left would be Paul Revere's house. But they're sitting on the sidewalk curb, and I had no idea what this really meant until I began to study it. And directly behind them is the Banca Ettore Fiori, which is the Italian credit union. Now notice, it's all men. So the idea was many of these men had come to seek work to send back food and money to their families, and the credit union could wire the money to Italy. Well, during this period, we saw the secession of different immigrant groups, and the North End would actually see many of the colonial buildings repurposed. This is Paul Revere's house, and of course, it's what it looked like when he lived there. Many people don't realize Paul Revere was married twice, and he had 8 children from each marriage. He was also a silversmith that had anywhere from 7 to 10 apprentices living with him at any given time. So there might have been 21 people living in this house at any given time. But by 1900, it was the Banca Italiana, where you could actually do your banking with tellers who spoke your native tongue, or work at the F.A. Gauduti Cigar Company, which made wonderful cigars that were then sold by S.S. Pierce. These 18th century buildings survived, but they were repurposed. And even here, Henry Thoreau, who lived in Concord, would actually have been born in this house. It was built by the Thoreau family in 1727 on Salem Street, and it survived in this photograph of 1905 as Levi Goldman's Redemption Center. Now, in research, I found that Levi Goldman was a Russian Jew that had come to this country. He did have, as it says, metal, paper, glass, and paper stock, and he would actually be a man who redeemed all of these things. He eventually did quite well. You can see him standing in the doorway with his 2 grandsons and lived on Elm Hill in Roxbury, a very comfortable area. But these are great examples of 18th century structures, and even Salem Street in the North End, with a combination of both wood-framed and brick row houses, has a sign in Hebrew that says Shabbat and prayer shawls. So the North End was an overlay of all different types of ethnic immigrants, whether it was religious or ethnicity. And in this way, many people live there, including along what is today Hull Street. Now, I want you to look at this photograph. You see the Old North Church in the distance, but these are buildings mostly wood-framed, and this dates to 1885. But a decade later, you saw most of the buildings replaced with tenements. Most people coming from Western Europe were agrarian. They had never lived in an urban center. And these tenements would be 3-room apartments with 1 room, the kitchen, having the only heat. There would also be 1 toilet per floor, not per apartment. And the city of Boston would set up bathhouses throughout the North End, West End, South End, and South Boston. So the aspect was Boston was becoming more densely populated. And by this period in 1900, the North End, which was only 4 square acres, had over 75,000 people speaking 21 different languages and dialects. And in that way, along the coast of Boston Harbor were all of the industrial area. Well, this is an area that was called Commercial Street. Now, Commercial leads on to Atlantic Avenue, and you can see an elevated railway. Now, you're all too young to remember the elevated railway that went from Sullivan Square in Charlestown to Forest Hills and Jamaica Plain, but there was an elevated railway that connected North Station and South Station. And seen here, this area was a place adjacent to the Copp's Hill burial ground. Well, the Purity Distilling Company had a storage tank, seen in the distance, for the fermenting of molasses, initially to create ethanol during World War I, as weapons were used, and of course they collapsed under pressure. The 2.3 million gallons of molasses spewed onto Commercial Street, and the accident would cause 21 deaths, 150 injuries, and heavy damage. Now, we've heard that molasses was used in the distillation of rum. But during World War I, the Purity Distilling Company did have molasses in this tank, but they used it in comparison in some ways with the addition of gunpowder to be filled into the bombs that would then be sent to help for Western Europe during the war. And the idea was 2.3 million gallons is a whole lot more than Grandma's molasses on the kitchen shelf. Well, the story was that this tank was 4 stories in height with partitions and would ascend the 4 stories. So really it was an 8-story tank with 4 stories of supports. The sides were riveted, and they were never inspected by the sealer of weights and measures for the city of Boston. And it was even said that the molasses was dripping from the sides of the tank day in, day out. And children would gather it. And of course, they're being used not only in just baked beans, but gingerbread, molasses cookies, and a variety of other things. My father once spoke of actually having Italian bread smeared with molasses, which I refused to taste. But the idea was it was used. Seen here, it actually spewed forth on January 15th of 1919. The morning started below freezing, and by noontime it was 60 degrees, typical Boston weather. But the molasses heated up and began to expand and caused the rivets to actually pop. And in that instance, it was said to have descended the 4 stories at 30 miles an hour, pressing everything within its wake, either one way or towards Boston Harbor on the right. On the upper left, you can see the elevated railway. But this was an area not just of the Purity Distilling Company, but it had wooden structures. Many times, people don't realize, along this area and Rutherford Avenue in Charlestown, they had shacks that would be vegetable shacks, such as potato shacks, squash shacks, pumpkin shacks, things that could actually be something that could sustain cold weather. But they were wooden, and they were spewed, as you can see here, from one end to the other by the molasses. The elevated railway on the upper left-hand side was actually crinkled. Now, these are steel girders, and this was something because everything was being pushed by the molasses. And not only did they actually see at least 36 horses either dying outright or having to been put down because of broken legs, the Red Cross came out immediately, and if you notice, the woman's feet cannot be seen. It was between 6 and 8 inches of sticky molasses. People realized in some instances that molasses, which many of us think of that tablespoon on the kitchen counter as a horrible aspect of trying to clean up, looked at this, and you can see here in the foreground that is not water, that is molasses. It permeated every sidewalk, every cobblestone street, and of course, all along Boston Harbor. And many people realized that there was really nothing much they could do. They actually had to look at this as something that would be a cleanup project that would take months, if not years. And during that period, 21 people died, a few others within a year. But the whole aspect was, even the Boston Fire Department Marine Headquarters was moved off its foundation on the right. And it was the foundation that actually many people realized that actually all the records would actually be lost. Colonel Buchanan of the fire department decided, why not spray the hoses of Boston with salt water from Boston Harbor? Remember, there were marine boats, and they could actually do that. But if you've ever tried to move molasses in January, you begin to realize in some ways, even if it is water that happens to be salt water, it doesn't go very far. And during the period, many people said you could smell molasses for years on end, especially during the hot, muggy days of August. Well, the North End is an important place. It not only was the place where we saw the slave auction, and we saw many of the immigrants of the 19th century, including Paul Revere. His house would be restored in 1907, as it conjecturally was thought to have looked in 1680. Of course, 21 people could never live in these 5 rooms. But the North End would also, in some ways, with Grant Wood's painting depicting the legendary story of the American patriot Paul Revere, as learned from an 1863 poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. From a bird's eye view, the painting shows Revere on horseback racing through a colonial town square in Massachusetts. He's become part of history. But also, the Great Molasses Flood. And the devastation was incredible. I don't think anyone could ever imagine the amount of devastation. But the whole concept is, when we look at the North End today, primarily thought of as an Italian-American community with live fish markets, and that's Giuffre's, and the North End Meat Market, and a mini hay market down Salem Street, we realize in some instances that Grandma's molasses has more of a story to tell you than basically what you might have thought. Molasses was part of the world trade economy of the 18th century. It fostered the aspect of anti-slavery movement in Boston and eventually led to the Emancipation Proclamation. And as I said earlier, it was also the first molasses flood in the world. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Please.
Before sugar made from sugarcane was introduced to Europe, what did Europeans do for sugar? Was sugar beet or?
You know, it's so funny you say that because it was beet sugar. And beets were actually something in a lot of ways. If you actually use them, you can tell how sweet they are. Do you know who actually invented the extraction of sugar from beet sugar? David Child, the husband of Lydia Maria Child, who created the poem "Over the Bridge and Through the Woods to Grandfather's House We Go." So it's a really interesting thing. Yes?
The elevated train.
Yes.
Not station itself. Is that torn down?
During the World War II, they used it for scrap metal in 1942. And at that point, few people were actually using that to connect one to the other. The automobile was quicker and the buses than taking the elevated. But they actually remain those steel girders right through to the early 1950s. Any other? Yes. Yes. Well, the aspect of the South was agrarian. There was no industrial revolution in the South. I think the best aspect of industrial revolution in the South was Eli Whitney's cotton gin to remove the seeds from the cotton. There was nothing. The North had industrialized in the 1820s to the 1860s. The South remained an agrarian economy. And I think in a lot of ways, slavery would have failed eventually anyway, but it was something that many people wanted to eradicate. Any other? Yes, one last question.
How did we get the molasses in from the ship to that holding tank and then processed into rum or whatever it is?
Right. Well, Purity Distilling Company was a 2.3 million gallon tank, and by 1919, a ship would come into Boston. And my father was treasurer of the Boston division of Domino Sugar, so I have sweetness in my blood. But they would pump it from the ship into the tank. But the idea was they would remove it by amounts to be combined with gunpowder, because the factory was right next door, to make the bombs. So they had nothing to do with molasses being used for rum. This was actually a tank to be used for munitions. But if you were to make rum out of a molasses, you would still basically have a hogshead, those wooden barrels. So.
How
It binds the gunpowder. It binds it together to create a solid substance that can then simply be molded and put right into the bomb and then shipped. It was really quite effective, believe me. Did you have a question? Yes. Well, the problem with the Amoskeag is like the problem with Hunneman engines from Roxbury. They were sufficient when Boston was a town. But by the period of the 1860s and 1870s, and the Great Boston Fire of 1872 was an important part, these buildings were 5 stories in height. So you could have an engine that could actually spray 5 stories because it's always thought that the water coming down is more beneficial to eradicate a fire. But the fire plugs, or what we call a hydrant, didn't have the water power or pressure. So invite me to give you the lecture on the Great Boston Fire, and you'll realize the calamity of errors in that. Well, I do have the copies of the Christmas tree book. I was here a couple of months ago, and the book still had not come out, but it came out, and I do have them. They're $25 if anyone wants to remember the Christmas tree shops. But it's a fun thing to come here again today, and thank you for having me.